Okay, hello. Today we're talking about fecal sludge management, and our focus is on pit latrines and septic tanks. These are common fecal waste containment units that are found in cities, municipalities, town councils, and even the villages, depending on where you're located. For starters, let's dive into the key concepts. Firstly, let's talk about fecal sludge. This may be undigested, in this case, fresh or partially digested, slurry, and the combination of all this is called excreta. Here we're talking about urine and feces. And the best example we can refer to is the pit latrine. Now, for the septic tanks, these are on-site systems that need water to be used or operate. And in this case, they contain the liquid and solid materials that accumulate in this point. And as they settle into the septic tank, we have a division of layers. And in this case, you're looking at the solid settling at the bottom, which is also known as sludge. Then you have a layer of liquid on top, and then scum. So in a septic tank, there is partial digestion. Depending on how well it's constructed, you will have a level of anaerobic activity happening in the septic tank. So there is partial treatment that happens in septic tanks. For clarity, what comes out of a pit latrine is what we refer to as sludge, fecal sludge, whereas what comes out of a septic tank is what we refer to as septage. So now that drives us to why do we need to treat this waste? The first thing is it has to do with public health risks. So the reason why we treat this waste is to ensure that we manage or prevent public health risks associated with exposure of this fecal waste into the environment. Fecal waste has a high concentration of bacteria, viruses, helminth eggs, protozoa, all these clustered as pathogens. And these, once exposed to the environment, can lead to disease or diseases like cholera, dysentery, diarrhea. And then the other is to do with health protection, environmental protection. Here with the environmental protection, we're looking at preventing pollution of water bodies. In this case, both surface and groundwater. And this pollution could be a result of nutrients. In this case, we look at the nitrates, phosphates, which cause eutrophication in these water bodies. And eutrophication is the accumulation of algae, and this algae consumes oxygen that would be needed by the fish for growth and also affects the water quality. So ensuring that we treat this waste to permissible standards set by the World Health Organizations or those responsible for the standards for discharge is key so that we prevent environmental pollution. And then lastly, we talk about issues to do with resource recovery. Resource recovery is vital because we need to understand the circularity of the products that we put in these containment units. So the kind of output you will have at the end of the treatment process is largely determined by the inputs at the capture point, or what we call the user interface. For instance, if you want to have briquettes, then you have to have it sourced from a treatment system that will have a lot of solid concentration. These solids that are concentrated can then be lumped up and turned into briquettes, while combined with other materials like charcoal dust, or in other words, charcoal pieces to improve the calorific value. Then let's look at the treatment objectives. Why do we first of all have to treat this waste? First of all, we have to dewater or thicken. In this case, we're focusing on fecal sludge, to be clear. The first stage is dewatering. We remove the water out of this sludge so that we can concentrate the solids. The next is to do with pathogen reduction. Here we are sanitizing the waste, trying to reduce the pathogen load that is in this waste. And there are various treatment systems or mechanisms that are used in fecal sludge treatment. Some may use lime. The others naturally may have predation of microorganisms feeding on the other. The other things die off as a result of longer retention period. That happens a lot with Helminth eggs. Then the third here, we're looking at the third treatment objective here is stabilization. Here we're looking at reduction of the volatile suspended solids, the odors or the smell that comes out of this, and then also converting the organics into a more consumable format by microorganisms. So breaking down so that you have residues that can no longer be consumed by the microorganisms. Then the fourth is to do with resource recovery. And here, with resource recovery, as earlier mentioned, we look at recovering portion of the solids, the nutrients that may have been treated or reduced from the process and then transferred into either landfill, into the farms, or even used as a source of energy. The best example is biogas. That's one of the channels of resource recovery. And that brings us now to the fact that in the entirety of these objectives, the goal must be to balance the local context, regulations, and also the end-use options. So while we're looking at all these treatment objectives, that brings us to the main focus. Now, let's look at the urban sanitation challenge. This is a real issue. Yes, providing sanitation is quite challenging in the urban setting because of several factors. To start with, we have rapid urbanization. The population is growing, limitation of space, and yet the services need to be provided to these communities. So the end result is you're having a population that is growing with also income inequalities, which drive them to use cheaper options to contain their waste. For example, they may not be in position to afford connections to the sewer system, so they'll opt for the pit latrines as an alternative. The other is to do with low sewer coverage, because sewage systems are expensive. That's the reality. And they may be costly for many countries or even municipalities. Therefore, this limitation in coverage leaves the communities to opt for on-site sanitation options that could provide an alternative where there is low or no sewer coverage. But now, the biggest concern here is that pits fill up very fast. And managing this sludge means a challenge, because when the pits fill, some of the residents in those areas may lack the finances to empty these pits. This combined with the poor designing of the pit latrines, to be specific, those that are unlined, change the entire way of waste management, fecal sludge management. Those that are unlined, in most cases, the end result, when they are full, is backfilling or abandonment. Then you go to another space. Now, this has got an effect on groundwater sources and even in some cases the surface water. Whereas those that are lined, sometimes the end result, especially during the rainy season, you would experience overflows when they are full. So this leads to increased exposure into the communities, and that's actually quite a challenge because even those involved in emptying, the charges, because these are not regulated by many governments, some may overcharge, and this variation in prices also affects the willingness to empty, and also the lack of registered service providers makes it also another problem. What actually goes into these pits? Let's classify the waste so that we understand the clarity. The first one is we're talking about feces and urine. This combination provides you excreta, and the source is definitely a human being. So a combination of feces and urine, you have that called excreta. Then if you combine excreta with flash water, you get black water. So when you're sitting in the flushing toilet and then you do the urine, feces, and then add that flash water, the end result is the product that comes out is what we call black water. The other part is now if you combine your bathing water, laundry from washing clothing with what is coming out of the kitchen, the result here is gray water. So now that we have understood the different categories and how to name them right, that now drives us to think about the kind of systems that contain this type of waste. We have dry systems to start with. With the dry systems here, we're looking at the pit latrines, for instance. There is no need for water. Toilets sit directly on top of the pit. The pit is dug into the ground, or even a vault. Those who have seen the EcoSan toilets. The other is to do with the wet systems. These need water to operate, to flush the waste into these septic tanks or these collection units. And some may be connected to a soak pit, which drains out the water. So here we're talking about retention of solids in the toilet as the liquids percolate. The septic tanks, whereas they are those that may be designed to just fill up and then are emptied, but this comes along with challenges in cost. So having understood the different type of systems, and one of the determinants of the type or choice of sanitation technology is usually availability of water, and that is what determines the type of system the client or the community is to use. Now, here we're looking at the output discussion between fecal sludge and then septage. Remember, fecal sludge is from a pit latrine. Septage comes from the septic tank. So here we're looking at materials from the bottom of the pit vault, and this one has usually a higher concentration of solids and urine. However, there's a disclaimer to this. This is greatly dependent on how the pit latrine is constructed. In this case, if it's lined, then you will have also higher volumes of moisture. If it's unlined, most of the moisture will percolate through the soil, and then you will have a higher concentration of solids. Now, for the septage part, we're looking at wet systems. In this case, we're talking about a mix of sludge, the sponatan and scum layer, like earlier explained. So this now gives you an overview of the output of what comes out of each system. Now, let's look at the sanitation service chain. Do we understand how the system works? Look at it as a bicycle chain, something that is interlinked. So for sanitation to be effective, it must function as a chain, and a chain with a very good closed loop. Now, to start with, we have the user interface where you collect the feces from. That point where you dump the feces, that's the user interface. That's your toilet. Then we have the area of storage, which could be the pit or the septic tank. Then we have the emptying and transport. Emptying and transport, you have seen cesspool trucks or these three-wheelers called tuk-tuk commonly in Uganda that are used to transport fecal sludge from areas where they're emptied. And here we are talking about standard emptying, which may be use of the gulpers, poo pumps as emptying methods. And then we have the pit vac, while for transportation, usually they are cesspool trucks. Then you have, these days I see people improvising with barrels to transport also this waste mounted on trucks, and also the three-wheelers or tricycles. Then the other is to do with treatment. Treatment, here we're looking at the different treatment options. Fecal sludge is specifically has different methods of treatment, and fecal sludge is taken to a fecal sludge treatment plant where the solids are concentrated, the liquid stream is handled differently, and then the solids are also handled in different ways. So some of the things that you need to understand or need a hint on, you might have seen drying beds, those handle the solids. Then you have seen ponds, for instance, around those areas. Those help in polishing or improving the nutrient quality. And in this case, bioremediation comes in handy. Then lastly, the thing that we talk about closing the loop has got to do with end use. In some cases, disposal is the ultimate end point, but that is largely discouraged. So the focus is more on resource recovery, where this product at the end of the service chain is fed into another area. For example, energy, agriculture. These are some of the resource recovery avenues that can be used in relation to fecal sludge. Just to emphasize, sanitation works as a chain and not in isolation. And our focus here, we are looking at treatment, which is key for the next session. Now, our goals here for treatment are majorly four. The first one has got to do with water content, moisture content. Fecal sludge contains up to 80%. Let's talk about 80% moisture, then 20% solids. And then the other is to do with managing the oxygen demand. Make sure it's low so that does not promote rapid growth in water bodies. And then the other thing to do here with our treatment goals is suspended solids. We need to manage them, concentrate them so that we can easily remove them from the water or waste that has come with this moisture. Then lastly is to do with the pathogen concentrations. So we need to manage these pathogens and ensure that they don't get into the environment and cause us problems. Now, how do we measure the success of these goals? The first is to do with pathogens and solids. Now, here we're looking at bacterial indicators. E. coli is one of the proxies that is used to identify contamination. Dangerous pathogens. Here we're looking at those that cause diarrhea, cholera, dysentery. Now, the other here is to do with solids. How much of the solids are removed out of the moisture that is available. In moisture, we're talking about the water. In this case, we look at the total suspended solids and then the total solids. So these are some of the parameters that are looked at when analyzing fecal sludge. Other success we can look at is to do with oxygen demand. Here, we look at it in two aspects. There's the chemical oxygen demand, which measures all organic material. Then you have the biochemical oxygen demand, which measures only bio-oxidizable material. The other one is looking at COD, or chemical oxygen demand, looks at the oxygen needed to oxidize both organic and inorganic materials, while for the BOD, which is biochemical oxygen demand, looks at the oxygen needed to break down only the organic portion. However, this is a clear reminder that in your analysis or whatever results you get, COD is always higher than BOD. Reason being, COD gives you a totality of both organic and inorganic, whereas BOD will give you only the organic portion. Now, the key takeaways from here are: 1. On-site sanitation. You're looking at the pits and tanks. Is a long-term reality for these urban centers. In this case, it's something we have to live with, so we need innovation for us to be able to maneuver and find solutions. The other here, we're looking at treatment objectives being met to stop the fecal-oral disease transmission route, because here we are trying to minimize having this fecal waste with a high pathogen load distributed into the environment with the likelihood of causing disease, like I earlier mentioned, things to do with cholera, dysentery, and typhoid, and also prevent environmental damage. Lastly here, knowing your sludge is very important, because this will help determine what treatment option you will use or you will require for the kind of sludge that you'll be picking. Just to give clarity, Septage has got a high liquid content. Here we're talking about what comes out of a septic tank, whereas for fecal sludge, you have a high solids concentration. Now, therefore, this will determine the kind of treatment strategy. Thank you very much for following this session. For any questions, you'll drop them in the link, and we'll keep learning until we get there. It's a time for sanitation to shine. Until next time, I am Isaac. Goodbye.